Content and quality both matter. In fact, they matter a great deal. This week's entire Torah reading is dedicated to the whole precept that they do count for so much in this life. Korach is the name of the Torah reading. Korach also is the individual who led the insurrection against Moshe Rabbeinu, against Moses, our teacher, and all of Moses' accompanied cohorts. Korach rose up against him, was a cousin of Moses himself, and wanted to wrest power away from Moses because he believed that others were better suited to carry the mantle of power than he. For example, Korach thought, me. So Korach raised a rebellion against Moses, and there are a few key elements that are worthy of our note as we look at the Torah reading this week. One of them is told to us in the Mishnah, in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avot. It says that some controversies are eternal. They have the breath of life infused in them, and they just live and breathe forever. They continue to give and are consequential for our lives because the things that they state inside of them, inside of the arguments, are so pertinent and so powerful and important that they are literally forever. An example, Hillel and Shammai. As they fought, as they argued, as they swayed, as they bargained, as they cajoled, they did so not for the sake of supremacy. They did so l'shem shamayim. They did so for the sake of God. Their arguments were precisely just for that cause, that aim, for the sake of God, and therefore they endured through all time. And the second example chosen by that same Mishnah is that of Korach. Korach's arguments did not last. In fact, they barely had the breath of life in them before they were ultimately extinguished by God himself. What is interesting by that Mishnah is that it contrasts Hillel and Shammai on the one hand, and it contrasts Korach and the others on the other hand. And if it were really going to be a true contrast, equal on both sides, it would say Hillel and Shammai, and it would say Korach and Moses. And why doesn't it say that? Perhaps the reason it doesn't say it is because it wasn't merely an argument against Moses' authority. It was an argument against the body of the people Israel. What Korach was trying to do was undermine the people Israel. Even though he was one of them, he was out to pull the rug from under their feet, to, as it were, be his own worst enemy. We know people like this. Unfortunately, there are people who think the worst of themselves and are out to denigrate and even to desecrate things that belong to them, that are holy. Perhaps a more nefarious, more evil aspect of human nature cannot be found. It's one thing when people outside of us seek to undermine us. It's another thing than when those who are in the inside, our own core family, say things, do things that are negative against us. And perhaps that's why it says Korach against the people and not Korach against Moses, because his argument was truly against God as well as the nation of Israel. There's another interesting point that arises at the very beginning of the Sidra. A guy by the name of On ben Pelet, the son of Pelet, just comes up out of nowhere, of the tribe of Reuben. And why his name comes up and what happens ultimately with On, we don't really know, except the fact that he's not swallowed up by the earth, along with Korach and the rest. And one wants to ask, well, who was he and what happened to him? The Talmud fills in the gap by saying that On ben Pelet, this one person whose name arises for this time and seems to disappear into the vicissitudes of time afterwards, he was married, and his wife said, On, let's talk. What you want to do is you want to undermine the authority of Moses. So basically what you're doing now is you're following blindly after Moses. And then what you want to do is place Korach in power after Moses has been deposed. And then you want to follow blindly after Korach. What are you doing, my husband? Those words penetrated very deeply under the thick layers of his ego. And On ben Pelet saw the wisdom of his wife and realized that he indeed was following down the wrong path, and quickly jettisoned that path and went back instead to the place of God. Why this is important to know is that sometimes advice comes from the smallest, almost innocuous places that we may not choose to acknowledge. Oftentimes we don't listen to our husband or our wife or our children or our parents. and yet they have very great wisdom to offer to us. Sometimes we don't listen to the wisdom of our elders. Sometimes we ignore good advice that's given to us from people who should be trusted, but we take for granted. And so this very small vignette that points out that we need to listen. We need to listen very carefully, because sometimes we follow down a dark path that leads in the wrong direction. There are many powerful concepts that come out of the Siddur of Korach. These are two. Make sure that you take your place with your people. Make sure that you always take advice from people who know better. Listen carefully. And when the ego wants to be stronger, to overrule them, ask yourself, what am I doing this for? What am I arguing for? Maybe the truth will become apparent. Shabbat Shalom.